Okay, welcome back to our discussion on doing CRUD. We left off in the last video by looking at how to delete. Okay, so let's look now. Let me comment this out at how do we do queries. How do we read? Okay. Okay. So lucky for us, the pattern is pretty much the same. So let's say I want to get back a quotation ID and a author name and a quote. How do I do that? Well, I'll simply have a variable named read quote. Okay. And of course, that's where I will prepare my query. And so it's a simple select. So I'm going to say select quotation ID, author name, and the quote. Okay, and then I'm going to say from. So notice I am not using placeholders because I am the one who is actually making this query. So I'm not expecting the user to do this for me. Okay. All right. Where? Okay. So this is the part where yes, the user will tell me which quotation. Okay, and so where quotation ID is $1. That's a placeholder. Okay, so depending on what is passed in, that's the row I will return. Okay, but we know that it has to be a row from the quotations table. All right, and in this case, we're only returning one row since query row returns one row. Okay, so we need our variables. So let's say we have a quotation ID, okay, which will be initialized to 0. That will contain the quotation ID. And then let's just use var author name. That will contain the author name. And then quote will contain the actual quote. Okay, and since they are initialized to the 0 value, so these are both the empty string. So we have the three variables we need, and so we will simply call db.query row. Okay, and of course we'll pass in the prepared statement. And what do we put in? Let's say 1 for now. Okay, because I think we deleted 1. Let's see. Select quotation ID from quotations. All right, so we only have 2, 3, and 4. But we're going to ask for 1. Let's see what happens. All right, so after I run the query row, a row should be returned. Okay, I'm going to save that. So this, whatever row is returned, will be saved in this variable row. And so now, what I need to do, I need to actually call scan. Okay, so it's here. I will say row dot scan. Okay, and so I'll pass in the variables that I need, that I will use to hold the answers. Quotation ID, ampersand. Notice we are using ampersand. Author name and ampersand quote. Okay, Now, if there's an error, then that will be returned. So, okay. So if something goes wrong, let's look at it, right? So notice it's telling me that there will be an error. Okay. So if something goes wrong, the scan function will return an error. So I will save that. Okay, and then let's just check. Okay, so uh, there are possible errors, it turns out, um, where we can get an error which tells us that no rows were returned. Okay, we could get some other error that we are not, that Go has not told us about, and of course we could receive nil, meaning no error. So we could do an if, but the pattern is whenever you're doing a read, there's a pattern that Go programmers follow, and it's to just say to do a switch. Okay, you're familiar with switch, so we're gonna switch on error. Okay, and we're gonna look at the different cases. So in the case that we do have an SQL that uh, error no rows. Okay, if this is the error that is returned. Okay, and by the way, uh, this error no rows is just a variable that is found in the SQL uh, package. Okay, so in this package, if you look at the documentation, you will see that there's a variable called error no rows, which signifies when no row was returned. So if no row was returned, I could simply, let's just say fmt that print line, something like oops, no rows were returned. Okay, so another case would be when nil is returned. Okay, when nil is returned means we didn't get any error, and so we could just print the row. Okay. I could just say quotation ID, comma, author name, comma, quote. Okay, and of course, if it's not nil and if it's not error no rows, then it means some other error happened which we do not know about. So we'll make that the default, and then if it's the default, then we'll just say log that fatal error. Okay, and so this is how we do it. What we do if we want to get back um, a row. Okay, a single row. A single row. Let me say that again. One row. All right. The instance where you want to deal with multiple rows being returned, we'll deal with that in uh, in another video. But for now, we're only looking at returning a single row, since this will return a single row, since you're asking for a specific row. Okay, so if the row is returned properly, then error will be nil, and then you can print the row. Otherwise, you can give some other message. So again, step one, we prepare our query. We only have one placeholder, which is what the user might ask for, right? So the user might put in an ID or put in a name or whatever. And so we need our variables, which will ultimately hold the pieces of the row, the columns of the row. And then we simply run query row. We give it the SQL statement that we prepared. We give it the values that will be used to replace the parameters. So notice the VS Visual Studio Code is telling me what will be returned, what will be whatever. Anyway, let me not say that. It's just telling me one is one. Anyway, yeah, so we have the query and we have the replacement. And query row will return a row, right? A row, a pointer to a row. Okay, and so this row is what I will inspect, is what I will ask questions of. So I will say row.scan. I'll pass in the addresses of these variables, which will store my answer. And scan can return an error. Okay. Notice query row, okay, doesn't return an error. Okay. So it just returns a row, and that row might be good or not. So for us to actually determine if the row is good or not, we have to call scan on that row. And then we will know if the row is good or not, because an error will be returned. Okay, so I save that error, and then I simply do a switch. Okay, and all of you know what a switch is. So we're gonna check the error, and we're gonna see if it's actually this. If it is, we're gonna print this message. If it's nil, we're gonna print this message. And if it's something else which we don't know about, we're going to stop the program. Alright, so let's give this a try. Okay, so I'm just going to say go run main.go. Okay, so no rows was returned, which makes sense because we asked for 1, but 1 is not there. So let's change this and say quotation ID 2. Okay, so we should get back something. And we do, we get back Lao Tzu, mastering others is strength, mastering yourself is true power. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. Again, you just need to recognize the pattern. Alright, and so what I want to do in the next video, I want to show you how we can use a struct which will allow us to save the entire row. So instead of having to define individual variables, we can simply create a struct which will hold the entire row, and then we can process it that way. Right? That's a, you'll notice that it's the common way of doing things. So I'm going to show you that pattern as well in the next video. I'll see you then.